Good morning, leadership scholars. Thank you for allowing me to join you this way today. Man, you just can't beat a stomach bug, can you? Well, I couldn't anyway. So thanks for allowing me to present Courageous Followership via video this morning. I know your speeches went well. Can't wait to grade my pod. Okay, so today, in fact, this whole week, we are talking about the F word in leadership. Dun, dun, dun. Followers. Okay, it is not sexy, right? And I told you guys this. I've been doing some research in followership because it's, I would say, an emerging trend. We'll talk more about that on Wednesday. But this idea that we can't separate leaders from followers, right? If you don't have followers, you're not a leader. And if you're not engaging with your followers in that process, like we talked about the definition of leadership being, then you are not truly being an effective leader. So courageous followership is one element to what we need to do as our role as a follower. You're going to be a follower in 98% of your personal and professional life. Isn't that crazy? I mean, that's a huge statistic, right? Even middle managers are followers. Heck, even our president of our university, our interim president right now, right? He's a follower. He follows our board of directors, or board of regents. So we have so many times in our lives that we are actual followers. And so we need to spend more time talking about it and how can we do it in a way that is most beneficial for our organization. So you may have a mental image or a mental sound image. That wouldn't be a thing, would it? Okay, like you could probably see and hear this if you're a big Disney fan. So this is Peter Pan. Is my link not going to work? Of course it's not. Okay. All right. So these are the Lost Boys and Michael and John, two of the other human kids that were kind of kidnapped by Peter Pan. Debatable. And this song is We're Following the Leader. Okay. And if you remember, and you do not want to hear me, I'm taping this at like 5:15 in the morning. You do not want to hear me sing this, but we're following the leader, the leader, the leader. We're following the leader wherever he may go. Okay. Wherever he may go. How many times as followers do we do this? We just follow. We don't ask questions. We don't seek to figure out what our role is, right? We're just kind of going along to get along. And you may be like, yeah, Monday after spring break, Dr. Jen. Yeah, that's me. That's me right now. Okay, which totally can be. Now, this is the politically incorrect part. They go on to say, we're out to fight the Indians. We're out to find the Indians because he told us so. Okay? Not that they have a beef with the Indians. Not that they think that Tiger Lily is a prize meant to be captured. Not that they could see how they could work with the indigenous people. No, we're going to go fight them because he told us so. And he being Peter Pan. We're just going to blindly lead. Blindly follow, sorry. So when you think about this, right, blindly following people, this happens. This happens probably more than we want to think about. And so we can't just continue to blindly follow. So when we think about this idea of followership, we're going to talk today about the courageous follower, which is that blue book. Ira Shaliff, we're going to talk more about him in a second. But when we think about kind of I would say the OGs, the big guys when it comes to followership, Barbara Kellerman is another one. We don't talk a lot about Kellerman's work in this class just because, y'all, she's super negative. And so I just don't, I have enough negativity in my life. I don't need you, Barbara Kellerman. And then we've got Hamlin. He's a really neat guy. How to deal with being a follower in a very leader-centric world, which kind of goes to the Horowitz's book on the far corner. Mark and Sam, married couple. They're really, really neat humans. They're Canadian. They're hippies. They got matching tattoos that say, instead of YOLO, it says YOFO, you only follow occasionally. I mean, they're intense, right? To get matching tattoos that say that. And then they're in the art of followership. Ron Reggio, who is a really cool professor out of California, Ira Shalev again, and Jean Lippman Blumen, they have a really cool book about the art of followership. It has a lot of other things in it. We're going to spend a lot of time really kind of dissecting followership a little bit more on Wednesday and talking about my favorite followership model, which is Robert Kelly's model. And all this kind of came about in the 90s. So relatively young. We'll talk more about that on Wednesday. But today we're going to focus on this guy. Nothing like taking a creepy picture of somebody on a plane, is there? Okay, this is Ira Shalev. You know how I love to show you guys what the theorists look like. So Shalev, awesome dude. Attends a lot of the leadership conferences that I go to, but I've recently started going to the followership. There's a global followership conference, and these people are just amazing. This is before the first followership conference. We were actually on a plane back from Ottawa from the International Leadership Association, and y'all, I get so motion sick, like with everything. Planes, trains, automobiles, it doesn't matter. I'm sick all the time. And so this happens to be Ira. He was sitting in bulkhead, not in first class, but in bulkhead with me. And he is telling this gentleman next to him all about followership because the gentleman said, "Oh, what do you do, sir?" And so he starts telling him. So I'm taking a picture of this covertly, just because it's so cool to watch. I think a person who created this model and this idea kind of talk about it in the wild. Now, the second part of this really cool story, sorry, my dogs are crazy, is that I got really airsick, and Ira leaned across that poor man, and he said, "Oh, sweetheart, my wife gets well, he said wife. I later found out it was his girlfriend. That's the tea. Anyways, my wife gets airsick too," and he handed me his handkerchief. It was like the sweetest thing, and so I was like, "Thank you so much." But I was so like dumb and starstruck by this man that I offered the handkerchief back to him after I'd wiped my mouth, and he's like, "No, you can keep it." I'm such a dork. Okay, so that is my Ira Shalev story. And then the next year I saw him at ILA, and I said, "Mr. Shalev, thank you again for rescuing me on the airplane." And y'all, he didn't remember. It was a lollipop moment for him, right? It meant so much to me. He didn't even remember doing that. And I said, "Well, would you like your handkerchief back?" And he goes, "Oh no, honey, you can keep it." Anyways, so very funny. So that's Ira Shalev. That's the man who created the model that we're going to talk about today. So The Courageous Follower by Ira Shalev. When do we stand up to and for our leaders? And I think that this is kind of a cool place to start when we talk about followership, because this talks about followers being active in the process, right? What is our role within what we're trying to do? So we think about this. Good old Peter Northouse, in his definition of leadership, again, a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. Right, this is very similar to the definition of leadership that we talked about. When we talk about followership, according to Shalev, is that it is a relationship of mutual influence, right? The Daft theory the Daft definition that we talked about really talked about that reciprocity. Shalev says it has to be a relationship, and it's a two-way street, right? The other side of the coin, as the Horowitzes say, whatever that looks like for you, it is truly a relationship. That's what leadership is. So as leaders and followers, we're trying to figure out what is our common purpose, right? And that's the center node of our wheel that keeps rolling and grinding, right? We're grinding, and it's all about that common purpose. So you have that leader, you have that follower, but you have shared values. And the follower has to talk about the values and the leader has to talk about the values, and you have to understand how all of these fit together. That's the key to understanding followership. And what's interesting is that it's, again, not a word that is recognized. In fact, Microsoft Office doesn't recognize it. For those of you that are writing on Shalif or on Kelly, you will quickly find out that every time you try to write it, it puts a red squiggly line underneath it because Bill Gates doesn't believe in followership, apparently. But it is truly it's a word, it's an action, it's an adverb, right? It's what we are doing. It is a process. We're in that continual motion. So we think about, what is a follower? It could be one of these poor lost boys, could be Tinkerbell, okay? It is a role that we assume when we are working collaboratively. When we're working together, it's a role that we take on. So sometimes you are in a followership role, even if you have a leadership title, okay? In teams, we see this in a true team, right? We can have a team that someone steps up and leads in some aspects and then walks back down. We think about, we've got the NCAA tournament fixing to gear up, right? So we've got basketball. There's sometimes where you need to be on the offense, right? And there's sometimes that you need to step back and you need to do your role and play that part of being a guard, right? You need to set up the guy for the shot. You need to make sure the gal has the outside shot, whatever your role is. So sometimes you're the shooter and sometimes you're the guard, and you've got to make sure that you understand it kind of goes back and forth. You're sharing that responsibility, but it's all about that common purpose. When a follower doesn't understand what the purpose is, they get lost. When the leader isn't communicating what that purpose is, then you're going to more likely have LMX in groups and out groups, right? So you can see how some of this is starting to work together. In the 6 P's, when we talk about people, right? Good leaders surround themselves with people who know more than they do, right? And so if they are doing that, then they know that sometimes I've got to take a step back and let my follower take a step forward, because it's almost like a dance. In fact, Irish Aleph Fabrino, what is her? Fabrino's her last name. She's fabulous. She's actually a trained dancer. They talk about followership being like a tango, right? That sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow, sometimes your step is according to what that leader is doing, and sometimes the follower has to swing around and do a different step. And what's interesting is that it's around that common purpose, which is creating that dance. So usually accept direction from formal leaders, okay? But followers can influence leaders to make better choices. They can do that, especially if they're in the in-group of the LMX, right? They can dissent from leadership actions also that are not serving the common purpose. Hey, this is against our mission. Hey, I don't think what you're asking me to do actually fits into what we need to do in the grand scheme of things in that bigger picture. Now, these are Shalif's 5 dimensions of courageous followership. So we're going to camp here for a sec. Let me tell you a little bit about Ira. And we found this out. I say we. There are a couple of our former graduate students that went to the Global Followership Conference with me, Hannah and Caitlin. And they both, it was really cool. I came out of a presentation, and they were sitting there talking to this little octogenarian man. And I looked closer and I was like, oh my gosh, they're sitting and talking to Irish Aleph with his girlfriend. And, yes, because it's so fun when 80-year-olds have girlfriends. And so we sat down, had a glass of wine, and talked to him. And Hannah, which some of you guys may know Hannah, she's an advisor now for hospitality. But Hannah just straight up asked him, like, how did you come up with courageous followership? Where did that come from? And he said, there's not a lot of people that know the true backstory of where this came from. He worked in DC. He worked in government. He was kind of a bureaucratic rat. And he started kind of hanging out with some people, as one does, right? You find your people. And they were part of an organization that he was like, hey, I really kind of like some of the tenets of this. And so he got a little deeper and he got a little deeper. And before he realized it, y'all, he was in a cult. You didn't think I was going there this morning, did you? Okay, so Ira Shaliff, in his, I think he said he was in his mid 40s is when this really happened. Is that he realized, hey, something's not right. There's some things going on that I don't know if I believe in. And he was talking to his mother one day, as we do even in midlife. And she said, Ira, do you not understand? You're in a cult. And he goes, no, Mom, I'm not in a cult. And she was like, yes, you are. Now, what's very interesting about Ira's background is that his mother is a Holocaust survivor. His grandparents and mother were taken, and he was, as he was doing his research and trying to finally get his parents and grandparents to talk about their experience, the reason why Ira Shaliff is on Earth is because a German soldier disobeyed orders and let his mother live. His grandparents were killed, but his mother survived. And she said, how many times have I told you the story of this German soldier? And he goes, and she goes, if he hadn't had the courage to tell his superior, no, I'm not going to do that, you wouldn't be here. If he had that kind of courage, Ira, you need the courage to actually walk away from this. You need to figure out what is truly happening, and you can't just blindly follow. And he said it was those words from his mom that made him really start thinking. So he was in a cult. Isn't this crazy? And this came from his mother, a Holocaust survivor. So models and theories and our inquiry just kind of comes from the most random places. So, well, let's start at the top, right? Assume responsibility for common purpose. What does that mean? Well, it means that it is both the leader and the followers' responsibility to understand what is the purpose. What is the purpose of the organization? What is the purpose of this job? What is the purpose of what's going on? And if the leader doesn't construct it, then the follower needs to do it. And the follower needs to get with the leader and they need to figure out what's going on. So when there's not a mission of an organization, so when we talk about a mission of the organization, that is the core purpose, why the organization is there, right? That's that common purpose. If you don't understand your mission, how can you move forward? And if you don't have a clear path of what that vision is, you don't have the steps to move forward. So you have to understand, where are we, who are we, and where are we going? And so followers need to have the courage to say, I don't get it. I don't see your vision. What do you actually want from us, right? Having that reciprocity relationship to say, what is our common purpose? Looking to support the leader and the group energetically. That takes courage sometimes, right? When you're like, you know what? I understand. I don't necessarily like this decision that the leader has made, but it's for the common purpose. And so how can we do this to the best of our abilities? So it's not being a overt, obnoxious optimist, right? But it's, where is the silver lining in this gray cloud? And how can I make that shine a little bit more? So supporting the leader and the group with positivity, with energy, with saying, all right, let's buckle up, buttercups, and make this work. Taking a moral stand if needed. So we talk about core values, right? We talk about that a lot at Texas A&M. We talk about how we as leaders need to understand our core values. What is our purpose, right? Those are our core values. And sometimes a follower's values is in complete, stark opposite to the leaders. And unfortunately, and this is just life, if that leader has a higher title and has a higher salary and has more power, then guess what? They win. Doesn't matter the who, what, when, where, and why. Their values will supersede yours. Now, if you have a new leader come in, they're changing the values of the organization, and you're like, yeah, I'm just not on board with this, then you have to have the courage to take a moral stand of, no, this is what I believe, this is what the organization believes, this is my line, and I'm not willing to cross this line. So moral stands are huge. I've only done it once in my professional career. Really had the courage. And when I say it's the courage to leave if that moral stand doesn't hold. So when I was working at Oklahoma State, my very first graduate assistantship was working with a program kind of like what our L3C is here. If any of you guys were in L3C, Living Learning Community, it was called the FIT program. And freshmen in transition, back when we could say transition without it being a naughty word, it was just actually talking about how do we help freshmen transition into being, adults in college. But I was hired by this amazing woman who ran the program. 3 months later, she left. Her husband got a job at Kansas State, actually, and so they left. And so we were in charge. Well, I was in charge for a while until they hired me a new boss. When they hired me a new boss, she was a bench scientist. So she was hardcore STEM. She was a geneticist, actually. And I was like, why did you hire her to be in charge of students? But whatever. And so the geneticist came in and she sat me down and she goes, so you're getting your PhD in leadership, right? I was like, yeah. And she goes, man, I didn't know they even had a PhD in touchy-feely crap. I was like, awesome. This is where we're going to go, right? My common purpose was to help these freshmen. What I thought the purpose of the program was to help these freshmen, right? They're going to learn. They're going to be part of the College of Ag. We're going to help them assimilate and figure out how to be adults, student development type stuff. And she just was having none of it. And this is when Facebook was really new, y'all, like only been around about 2 years. And she called me into her office one day and she was like, have you been looking at the freshmen's Facebook profiles? I'm like, no. Because even then, Facebook stalking was weird, right? And she's like, well, they're going and drinking and they're doing all this stuff. And so we need to call their parents. I'm like, whoa, no. Like, they're adults. Like, there's a federal law that says we can't do that. No. And she goes, well, we need to because we need to call them in here and they need to change their behavior. And I'm like, I don't know about that. Then a couple of other things happened along the way. And I was like, it was making me sick to go to work just because I was like, I don't want to deal with this because what she's doing is unethical and immoral. And I don't want to be a part of it. So I went to her boss and I said, Marianne's doing some things that I can't get on board with. This is why. These are my morals, my core values, what I believe student development is. I don't know if I can do this. And so the big boss was like, oh, get it. You don't like the way the program's going, but she's the leader of the program. So maybe you should look for another job. And I did. It was probably the only time have I quit? Like besides for moving purposes, I think that's really the only time I've quit a job. It's definitely the only one that I've done over a moral stand. And it was a really hard decision because at that point, I had moved my family to Oklahoma. I had an infant. We were there for my education. And if I left this graduate assistantship, I left a lot of money on the table. So I had to find another assistantship really quickly. So it was tough. And so, but there are some times that you just have to take that moral stand and say, hey, I'm not on board with this. You have to have the courage to participate in personal and organizational transformation. How can you be a better person? How can you make the organization better? And that takes courage. Anyone that's done any self-improvement, and that's more than just like, I'm going to eat better or I'm going to have New Year's resolutions and they're going to last 2 whole weeks. But really participating in personal transformation. Like, this is who I am. This is who I want to be. This is how I'm going to get there. There's some really great ways to do that besides reading self-help books. There's a whole, think about leadership development programs. It's a whole industry that's worked on that. And also other industries that work on that, personal coaches. You have a lot of leaders even that go through and have personal coaches to help them with that. But are you growing, right? When we talk about that paranoia P, are you continuing to grow? Are you continuing to make yourself better? Are you willing to engage in organizational transformation? And sometimes the answer is no. If your values and your morals and your ethics are not where that organization is going, if it's transforming, then you go back and you take a moral stand and you're like, yeah, I'm out. I can't be a part of this. And there's been lots of examples of students that have been in that like organizational transformation stage, some of my former students, and they're like, man, my organization is so much better. There's one in particular that he was talking about. It was a sales program, and he was telling me how when the organization actually changed some of their policies based on follower feedback, it made that organization so much better. And he was like, Dr. Jen, I was thinking about quitting because I can go sell something else somewhere else in a better environment, but they actually changed and it made it better. And so now my values fit. And so he talked about how much better of a follower he is because he was willing to participate in that transformation, which is pretty stinking cool. Then constructively question or challenge counterproductive policies and behavior. So on one side, you've got support the leader in the group energetically, right? Be positive. Be like, I'm in. I'm a team player. How do we do this together? But you also have to have the courage to say, why? Like, why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this? How does this help us get to our greater purpose? How does this challenge counterproductive policies and behaviors, right? Like, this doesn't make sense. So even that idea of A&M being open to me challenging Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 8 a.m. and doing, again, Monday, Wednesday, right? I had to say, is there a way to do this? I know this is a policy, but is there a way to do this better? Is this a way to be a little bit better on our behavior, change things up? And that did take courage. Now, the cool thing is, I'm sorry again, my dogs are nuts. The cool thing is having that courage, the worst they can say is no, right? And I think as followers, sometimes we build that up in our heads a lot. We think what is the worst can happen, and that's where we go. That's where our head is. This is the worst possible thing. But really, it's not. So when we think about followership, right, we think about being courageous. We think about engaging with our leader. I found this quote. I think it's really interesting. Followership is a discipline of supporting leaders and helping them lead well. It's not submission, but the wise and good care of our leaders, done out of a sense of gratitude for their willingness to take on the responsibilities of leadership and a sense of hope and faith in their abilities and their potential, which is pretty darn cool. Followers have a huge role in leadership, even though we are only spending technically a week talking about followership proper. We're going to see from now on in the rest of our theories how much the followers actually are prominent. So in the beginning of the semester, we have talked about how the leader, right? It's been about leader traits, and it's been about leader behaviors, and it's been about leader skills. It's been about a leader communicating. Now we're moving into how do we work with our people? How do we engage in this tango? How do we make life a little bit easier and better for our organizations while thinking about the follower? At the same time, I want you to keep that follower hat on and say, all right, as I'm looking and working through this as a follower, this is how this leader-centric theory works. This is how I know if I'm in the LMX in-group or out-group. And this is what I can do, right? If you are in that LMX out-group, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about LMX, that idea of moral injury, right? Moral injury, I think, is the catalyst to engage in courageous followership. When your values and that common purpose is so damaged, right? That is when you have to step up and you have to take a different look and a different role and a different approach. So as we move forward and talk about why do leaders need support? Well, heck, leadership's a hard job. So if you think about all the different pressures that are on Peter Pan, right? And it could be, depending on your organization, it can look like a lot. It could be stakeholders. It could be the administration, different interest groups. If you've got a board over you, if you've got donors, if you've got the law and procedures and standard operating procedures, if you've got SOPs, if you've got some budget issues, if you're trying to set a good example, develop relationships with your followers, also engaging in that task, right? Being a team leader like Blake and Mouton talked about, man, that's a lot. That's a lot. So that's why leaders need their followers. So we think about how can you help your leader manage the pressure? That's being courageous. That's stepping up and saying, what can I do to help you? And they may say nothing, right? They may say, I got this. And instead of saying, do you really? You can be like, I know you got this, but what can I do to help lighten your load, right? But then also think about, what are ways that leaders can give you support? Can you walk in and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. Can you help me with it? Or I need to understand the common purpose a little bit. Can we go grab a cup of coffee and actually kind of walk through this a little? And again, the worst they can tell you is no. But you have to have the courage to actually ask, right? No one's going to fulfill an order that's not put in. So you have to have that courage to do so. So when we are thinking about followership, right? Don't follow the leader just because he said so, right? We don't need to follow blindly Peter Pan. We know in the whole situation, Wendy, pretty much the leader in this situation, right? Peter supplied the pixie dust. Well, Tinkerbell did. But Wendy was really the brains behind the operation. And so when we think about who is that leader, right? Don't just blindly follow them because they've got that title. Followers serve the common purpose, not the leader. Here's a big lesson, and you've probably heard this before. Followers quit bosses, they don't quit jobs. And I have experienced this a couple times in my professional career as well, where you just can't get there with the leader. And so you start looking for other places. Your generation does that even better than my generation did, right? Because you're like, and I'm out. I don't want to have to deal with this, right? You don't see the world the way I see it, so I can find someone who does because I have more opportunities. So you have to understand what is that common purpose and see past the leader to the purpose. You have to have courage to challenge and support your leader, constructively challenge. We'll talk about that more when we talk about Robert Kelly's model. But understanding that, hey, asking why is not a bad deal, right? Being a critical thinker is a good thing. It's the thing that we're most worried about you guys losing because of AI, because of No Child Left Behind, because of so many different things, right? We want you guys to have critical thinking. We want you to walk out of Texas A&M, walk out of this class, understanding that your role as a follower is to engage in critical thinking. So moving forward, what does this look like moving forward? Well, we are going to have your knowledge assessment on Wednesday, which is very important. We're going to do it at the beginning of class, so make sure to wake up early and be here because it's an activity that we're doing together at the beginning of class. Remember, your extra credit is due March 30th, and that's the song. So if you missed me talking about that before spring break, jump on Canvas, take a look at that. And then we are going to dissect Robert Kelly on Wednesday. A lot of his stuff is in the book as well. So that's why I decided to move Shalif and kind of start with him, partly because he's not in our textbook, but really because I think it's a kind of an introduction, a really cool introduction. So Robert Kelly on Wednesday, followership today. You guys are great, and I will be there with you live on Wednesday. Thanks.